that we could literally use JavaScript to create elements that never existed before on our page. And then once we learn how to do that, we'll also learn that we can then pay attention and listen to what the user is doing on our pages. And since we know how to dynamically create elements, dynamically style anything that we want, we put that two together. And when a user does something, we could go and style things differently. We could go and find other information and put it on the page when it's available. And that is where we say that we're creating an interactive and dynamic web application. In a nutshell, that's what we're going to do. But if I drill down and kind of get you jazzed up a little bit about what we're going to do, basically, once we learn about interactivity, I kind of showed you this, but to practice our interactive and dynamic web application building, we're going to pretty much build this little game, right? So at the start of the game, this is what you're going to do. First, you're going to lay out something that looks like this, right? So at the start of this, we're going to build it in different versions, right? So the first part, it's all about, we're going to do it small, 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 layer everything on top, and at the end of it, your game is going to be working. But ultimately, we're going to need to, create this little, little box, put in a little image. Once we can create one of these, we can create nine of them, right? So we'll create nine of these, and then we use, we start using some Flexbox and stuff like that. Everything that we've practiced until we then, after we got our layout, and then we learn some JavaScript, then we'll learn, okay, well, we need to kind of show the user which sequence to remember. And to show them the sequence to remember, we're going to generate a random sequence. And then once we generate that random sequence, we are going to, take that sequence, put it together with our lights, and we're going to start getting the lights to turn on automatically. And it's going to look like this. Like that's JavaScript that's going to basically turn those lights on. And then we're going to tell the user, like, all right, do you remember that sequence? Go ahead and basically click on the lights in the same sequence that they appeared. And then the user is going to come in and start clicking. And then when they click on the right one, we're going to, turn that light on. When they click on the other one that's right, we're going to turn that light on. If they click on one that was not lit up in our sequence, then we're going to stop them like, hey, you just failed. And that is how we're going to play around and practice that interactive, also that dynamic piece, because we are going to be showing the user, like, hey, here's your best score yet. And if they could pick three out of, these nine light bulbs, we're going to increase that to four, and then five, and then six, and then all that kind of stuff, right? And then if they could do nine, then we could increase them to, like, 4 by 4, and then 5 by 5, and then 6 by 5. We can get this grid even bigger dynamically, and then show them how they're doing. So that's gonna be, us practicing how to use JavaScript, HTML, and CSS to pretty much build interactive and dynamic web application. And in case you haven't thought about it, to turn that light on, it's pretty much we're changing CSS on the fly. All right. Once you kind of get, the gist of this, then we'll also, over your homework, you're going to be working towards putting this together. So far, you know enough HTML and CSS that you can put this together. The way it looks, right? If you think about it, there's like almost like three boxes. Like there's like this top box right here that has all this content. There's like a left box that has this form right here. There's a right box that's gonna have our cards right here. So you already kind of know how to lay these things out. Now, what we're gonna do, we're gonna learn JavaScript that's gonna allow us to, whenever the user puts information in a form like this, we're, once we learn about events and events that happen in a browser, we're going to write JavaScript that's going to be sitting here listening and waiting for a user to click this button. And whenever this button gets clicked, we're going to learn the code to write so that our JavaScript can intercept all this information that's in this form, grab it, and since we know how to dynamically create new elements, we're going to use that content and dynamically lay out a brand new card on the fly, put it in this div that started out empty. And then you learn how to, on the fly, these buttons were created on the fly, the same as this card. And you learn that you could still, on those buttons, you could give this button an activity and action to just delete whatever just got created. So whenever the user clicks this button, we're going to then delete the card that has this button like this. So that is again interactive and dynamic web application using JavaScript. Once you get this piece right here, the next thing that we're going to talk about what we call APIs all this week. And when we're talking about APIs, you know, I'll tell you about how literally the APIs run this whole world. Um, for instance, next weekend I'm going to New York, and whenever you go to Airbnb, for instance, right? And let's say this is the trip. This map that you see here is not an Airbnb map. Airbnb is not in the business of drawing maps. You know where they get this map from? They're using a Google Maps. Basically, as soon as you drop in information here, this map that they're using here, this is a Google map. So they're sending, pretty much like latitude, longitude, or address information to Google. Google gives them, how to map or whatever it is. But this piece right here, this is a Google Maps. Look at this. You see Google right here? This is a Google Maps. Everybody tracking what I'm talking about? This is a Google Maps, meaning Airbnb is using Google Maps data. That is an API. It's an application programming interface, right? So we'll learn about, okay, how the hell does that happen, right? Or if you go, say, for instance, to WhatsApp and you try to send somebody like a GIF, whenever you send a GIF, like, say, I don't know, this is my friend, I think I could just send her, I don't know, just a random ass GIF, right? So if I do this, right? If I do that, or if I look for anything like haha, right? If I do that, all these GIFs, if you look clearly, carefully, these GIFs are coming from a service called Tenor. WhatsApp is using this service called Tenor, and if you look at Tenor, they're in the business of GIFs, all right. If I come here and I look for haha, right? This is what I see. If I go to WhatsApp and I type in, let's say I click haha over here, that's what I see, right? And what that means is WhatsApp is asking Tenor to give them all the gifts that they have about haha, all right? So we will learn how to use these APIs to then create something. Say, for instance, our application is going to look like this, but we're going to refactor this little application. We're going to take off this photo input field, and instead, I'm going to ask you to use an API that this service gives. I mean, I told you about Unsplash and how we could go and find some like free stock footage or stock photos. So, for instance, if I search for, let's say, Eiffel Tower, Paris, if I click that, they'll give me all these photos about the Eiffel Tower. So, what's gonna happen is I'm gonna ask you to figure out how their API works, and then we are going to refactor our app to where we remove this photo endpoint, and you end up with something that looks like this, where you just get a destination, location, and name. And then not only that, we'll also learn how to use some what we call web APIs, things that are, functionalities that are baked inside of your browser that, for instance, as you can see, if I refresh this page is going to ask me for my location. This is something that we could trigger from the browser. This is features that are baked into our browser that we could tap into and say, hey, whenever the user comes in, can you ask them for their location? And then once they say, okay, sure, we'll grant them access. When they do, then we can go ask some third party service like, hey, we know this user's latitude and longitude. Can you give us the weather at this user's location? For instance, when I do this, look at that. Now they know that I'm, somewhere Chelsea, Boston, and this is the weather, this is the humidity, this is the temperature. And that is JavaScript that's running behind the scenes. And then what I was, was talking about API. So if I go to Eiffel Tower, Paris, if I click add to list, then our JavaScript is still listening for me to click on this button. But then once it lifts off this information, it's gonna pass it to the Unsplash API, gets all these images, finds me a random image without having to wait for the user to give them an image. And once I click that, look at that. That photo just came from Unsplash directly. I did not enter this photo. That's basically me using somebody else's API to get data from that API and use it on my web application. So in a nutshell, we're going to be covering the foundations of JavaScript as a language. After we cover the foundations of JavaScript as a language, we're going to start learning about how we can use JavaScript together with HTML and CSS to create dynamic content, dynamic elements, dynamic styles. And then we'll start learning about events and how we can use JavaScript to create interactive applications. Then we'll put all that together to build dynamic and interactive applications. And after we do all that, we'll start looking at web APIs like that geolocation stuff that I showed you. And then we'll look at some third party or what we call REST APIs. And like how that Airbnb uses Google Maps. We'll go and use some weather map, weather API. We'll then use some Unsplash API. We'll use some GIF API. I'll expose you to different APIs and different documentations to a point where you can literally go and build any web application with any API whatsoever. And that is where we're headed this week. What y'all think? I think it's pretty exciting. It's gonna take what you think is badass to like a dangerous level. All right, and notes wise, basically, what we're gonna do today, it's we're gonna cover some of the stuff that we left off from day 4. Also, as as I'm showing you all these, day 1, day 3, whatever, I want you to remember, we had one day on like July 4th that we couldn't use. So as you see me move things around, I want you to keep that in your mind as context, right? So we're going to cover some Bootstrap, some Materialize, and looking at third-party CSS. And then to practice, right, I had to make a decision of like, okay, do we spend a whole day where you're building your portfolio website to just practice HTML and CSS? Or do I bring everything that we learn, HTML, CSS, Git, and helping you work in teams and merge conflicts and branches and all kinds of stuff? So I chose instead to have today during the class you're going to be working pretty much on a project that has different versions that is going to require you to even collaborate with somebody, where somebody's going to come and make they're going to push a branch up to your commit, and you're going to have to merge those conflicts and so on and so forth. So that way you can practice all these Git workflows that I know some folks is not supernatural to them, but also practicing the same stuff that we learned over the past week. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna start building the layout of our memory lights game, and it has different versions. We'll go all the way to version 4, which is gonna end us up to practice pretty much everything that we would have learned up to that point. Once or when we get there, then we'll start talking about JavaScript and the differences of JavaScript and Java, the different like data types, and some of the nuances that we have in JavaScript. So today is going to be more so practice and making sure that everybody's on the same page when it comes to HTML and CSS, and then introducing JavaScript. Any question about what we're going to be covering today? None? Perfect. So what I'm gonna do, let me share these notes with you. And then we'll just jump in. So what I want y'all to find out is this. When you look at the code that we've been building, right? When you look at the code that we've been building, pretty much all the text that we've put on our pages, they all look the same. Now, in CSS, there's one property that you can use to change how our code is going to look like. 10 minutes to break, copy that, Kate. So that property is font family, right? So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So font family